Excellent. We're having quite an interesting maize season this year, particularly in the U.S., which we'll talk a little bit more about. Obviously, we're coming to the harvest period for our own crop. We have a saying in the U.S. called "rain makes grain," and that's been called into question this year, but we've still had a very good crop given some of the excessive rains that we had this year, according to some. So let's jump right in. I will say that one difference here is that I'm going to talk about the AMIS numbers. We also do our own U.S. total numbers. There's not substantive disagreement between these numbers, but I do have some of my own slides at the international level just to emphasize some points with the data that were available. So when we look at AMIS maize production for 2015, you know, there's a couple of notes, important countries to look at. So the U.S. produced less maize this year, but it's still the third biggest U.S. maize crop we've ever produced. So still good yields and good area. If we look at some other big changes, European Union, when you think about the latitude of the Po Valley and how dry and hot, principally hot it got at that latitude, that's kind of the latitude that the corn is produced across the European Union for the most part. You know, lots of 35 degrees C days during the period of grain fill. That had a really negative impact on the size of the European crop this year after a really good crop the previous year. So a big downturn mostly or primarily on a lot of excess heat. So, you know, anything above 35 degrees C during the reproductive stage for maize, not a good thing. And that really impacts yields pretty hard for that particular crop. Ukraine also, AMIS has 24.5 million metric tons. We're right in that neighborhood as well too. Ukraine having a very split weather situation for them, right close to the middle of the western half of the country being very, very dry, even during July, with the eastern half having sufficient moisture during that same July phase, which for them is also an important reproductive phase for the Ukrainian crop. South Africa also having significant dryness and impacting their crop quite negatively. China having another big crop. This crop tends to grow over time and have some support through irrigation. So despite some dryness, the irrigation offset a lot of that production. So when we look at this graphically, you can see those same supportive comments. You know, the same comments in production is reflected in this graph with largely good conditions in China and the United States, some poor conditions in the United States, but other places really excellent growing conditions in the United States. European Union, again, lots of areas suffering from high temperatures and lack of rainfall, and also some dryness in Argentina as well too, as well as the Ukraine. So overall, good growing conditions in some locations, and then in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and Argentina, or at least Europe and the Ukraine and Argentina, the crop not quite as good. Okay, so when we look at the AMIS world supply and demand balance, production's forecast down from the 2014 record, but still a big crop. Trade to contract, but that also makes sense based upon the fact that you have a smaller crop. Trade is going to contract a little bit, and we've had production running over utilization for the past several years, which has built stocks, and we'll talk a little bit more about stocks in a minute, but stocks will contract a little bit as utilization expands. Although at a slower pace than the previous 2 years, production is coming down more. So these numbers, very consistent with what we have at USDA. Weaker consumption 2015 crop year for us because our maize crop is slightly smaller, but very consistent with what with the AMIS situation for the world. So for feed use, global feed use is to grow by 2% in 2015-16. In the U.S., we're going to have a bit of a decline. That is because of our smaller crop than the previous year. So again, we're having a very big crop, but areas down, and yields, although above trend yields, are still smaller than last year's very large crop. Okay, China, 3% growth is expected for feed use year over year. Now, in other uses, we have seen, you'll notice that that yellow bar in the U.S., that represents food, seed, and industrial for the U.S. Most of that's going to be ethanol. And you'll notice you're coming off, remembering that the U.S. the 2012 was a drought for the United States, you do have some increases from 2012 into 2013, even for the U.S., but that's also because we had shorter world supplies based upon that very significant U.S. drought. So, and in China, the second largest manufacturer of maize-based industrial products, mainly for starch, they're showing some increase as well too. We're going to have projected growth in Chinese FSI use. Now, when we talk about exports, again, this is largely driven by supplies in terms of exports. U.S. exports roughly flat year over year on a crop that's slightly smaller, but that Brazilian crop is up. But this is part of a long-run trend of growth in the Brazilian production of corn. We talked about, Joe talked about the fact that the real supports farmers' production of soybeans in Brazil because they're not seeing the same decline in the price of soybeans and reals as, say, the U.S. producer is. Along with that is that some of the growth in Brazil has been in their safrinha crop, their second crop, and that comes after soybeans in a double crop rotation. So, despite the fact that maybe corn is more expensive to plant as the primary, or cotton is more expensive to plant as the primary, because it's more exposed to the import cost of inputs, when first season soybeans grow, you have more of a chance to grow second season corn. So this is that safrinha crop's been growing over time, so that Brazilian crop's getting a little bigger, so we have exports growing for Brazil. Argentina, that crop's a little bit, expectation that crop will be a bit smaller, and that'll cut exports. And the Ukraine, obviously, we talked about the fact that that crop has suffered from some heat in the western half, that their ability to export will be reduced simply because they have less to export. Now, when we flip to imports, it's the same for the EU. That smaller crop is going to lead to additional imports of maize. Okay? And for China, again, we'll talk more about China's stocks of grains as well here too. So China imports down as China makes some adjustments in their own internal policy for corn and their growing stock levels. Okay? So let's look at this. Let's jump here to stocks, and we'll talk about this quickly in two different ways. So AMIS stocks below last year's record. So AMIS, of course, showing that your stocks coming down a little bit. Smaller crop production, lower stocks. It makes sense. We're going to have a little bit of smaller production off of that record production last year. So smaller crop, we're going to dig into utilization as dig into stocks as utilization continues to march up and production comes down a little bit. Now, one of the situations hidden in this, though, is let's go forward and let's break that out between the crop held in China and the crop held in the rest of the world. We talked about the fact that the stock of maize was shrinking. However, the stocks of maize inside China are actually expanding. So the Chinese are holding a greater share of stocks, and stocks held outside of China are shrinking more rapidly than they are in the world as a whole. So that's one of the important things to understand that here, though, is that a greater share of the corn stocks are locked up inside of China, and how the market perceives the ability to access those stocks will be important in how they perceive this contraction in stocks outside of China. So the rest of the world stocks falling while China stocks are growing. Okay, so let's talk about prices here just a little bit. I think the important thing to note in the left pane is how much prices have come down since 2013-14, but that they're not significantly different than 2014 and 15. Okay, so we're actually at the USDA in the U.S., for the U.S. price, have a slightly higher price for 15-16 than the prior year. But the point is that prices haven't changed all that much, but these prices at this level are down at below the cost of production for the average U.S. producer, so we'll talk a little bit about this. But the other thing that I wanted to add on the right pane from Ann's presentation is you'll see that little jump there in June and July, the dark blue line in June and July. When I talked about rain makes grain and the thought that maybe that didn't work this year, we had in the U.S., I can explain that bump by saying we had very heavy rains and we had what is a very unusual rain rally. Usually you have a drought rally We had a rain rally this year, very unusual. So in this case, folks were worried that this was going to cause very negative effects on the U.S. crop yield. That rally, we rose 70 cents a bushel. I'd have to convert it into metric tons, 70 cents a bushel, and then dropped 70 cents a bushel in the span of about 5 weeks. Okay, so this really was an unusual circumstance and caused a bit of price volatility, the appearance of price volatility in the maize market because of this unusual rally that we saw. Okay, then the other thing I want to show you here is U.S. maize area, and I'm showing you this over a little bit longer run because as we jump into talking briefly about the U.S., I want you to look at the shape of that curve where the U.S. area is growing and then it's turning down. Of course, it's turning down because we have lower prices, but I'll contrast this with our U.S. ethanol production and kind of tell you, okay, so when our U.S. ethanol production took off, we were planting the corn and producing the corn necessary to produce that ethanol, and now that our ethanol production growth has slowed, our areas and productivity has continued to increase, our corn area has turned down along with prices. Okay, and the other thing that I want to talk to you about is that there's been a lot of controversy in the United States this year as to what yield was for maize. Okay, when we do our projections, we don't take a simple trend when we look early on when the crop is just going into the ground and we're doing our estimates. We do a normal weather, a weather-adjusted trend. Those are two different things, a simple trend versus a normal weather trend. And so that's where we started out. And when you look at it, if you can see that little black dot way out there at the end, that is the current estimate for NASS for 168 bushels an acre. There's been a lot of discussion in the U.S. that that yield number started out too high and could not be that high, but now we've had 3 confirmatory estimates that say, no, in fact, we have had a slightly above what we would consider a normal weather yield. So some of this concern about the yield is this difference in understanding between what normal weather is and what a simple trend in production is. So again, we would be saying that we are having not a spectacular year, a year which is slightly better than what we would expect under normal weather. Okay, so again, this will be in your packet. It is the U.S. supply and demand balance for 2015-16. So we had lower area this last year, primarily driven by prices, maybe a little bit driven by planting weather. So we had some areas which were prevented from planting because of that moisture during planting season. But in other locations, we had dry open windows. That crop got in early. That moisture was very beneficial in the production of those crops. Yields down from last year's record, but still above what we would call our normal weather-adjusted trend. Now, we do have yields down in some states year over year based upon this excess moisture in a handful of states because of that moisture early in the season, but in many other states that rain proved to be beneficial, and we've got record or near record yields in a number of states in the U.S. Okay, we have some states which had records last year which saw poor weather this year, and so that's a contrast that people have to also keep in their mind. Okay. Simple U.S. supply, simple U.S. demand graph here showing feed and residual, food, seed, and industrial, again, primarily ethanol, and then our export path up until this past year. And the point I wanted to make about the U.S. area curve and compare it to this is look at our FSI use. Again, that food, seed, and industrial is primarily ethanol. One could maybe argue that there's been a slight uptrend in that ethanol number, but the growth is nowhere near what it had been in previous years, and it's actually quite small. And to Joe's point, we export a fair amount, you know, maybe on the order of 800 million gallons of ethanol a year. So that's quite a bit of ethanol for exports. And so our own growth in production and the use of corn grind for ethanol, not large growth year over year. Feed and residual has come back, and again, exports, that dip down in exports, again, very serious drought in the U.S. in 2012-13. So the last graph I want to show you is days of use. This is a stocks to use ratio that looks at corn, wheat, and rice. So it's a stocks to use ratio that converts this back into days of use so we can talk about these things in terms of kind of putting all the grains on the same level. What you'd see is wheat coming back pretty strong. Now, when you look at what the end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, very, very low commodity prices, what some would consider burdensome supplies of crops in storage, and we've come down from those levels pretty significantly during this time we've reduced stocks. For wheat, we're back up to, in absolute terms, for the USDA, in absolute terms, record carry-out stocks, okay? Now corn, again, corn stocks have been built. They turned down this last year, but above the levels we've seen of the last decade. So wheat, we've got growing stocks, large stocks. Corn, we're somewhere in, I would say, stocks better than we've seen in the last several years, while we've seen some pretty good declines in rice. And so I just say from the standpoint of maize, good supplies, good stocks, a good crop out of the United States, some challenges in other countries, the Ukraine and Argentina and the EU, but overall a good situation for the maize crop.